Okay, well, hello everyone. I hope you're doing well. So today we are going to be introducing probability, and in particular, some words that we use to describe probability. Now, probability, just before we get started, probability is something you use every day. Every time you're thinking about how likely is it for something to happen, you use probability. Every time you make a decision, in fact, because you're thinking about the consequences of your decision. How likely are those consequences to happen? For example, when you're driving, how likely is it that you're going to crash? When you make a particular turn, how safe is it? How likely is it that you're going to go through the turn safely? Of course, there's game shows built on probability. What are the chances of them peeling back a sticker to reveal a word? Or what are the chances of a spinner landing on a correct thing? Gambling, all sorts of things. A lot of things that you want to stay away from, actually, because as I'm sure you'll find in lots of probability subjects, it's not very likely that you win. It's more likely that you lose. And that's why these companies are still around, the gambling companies. They're making lots of money because you're not. But there's probability in sports. There's probability in card tricks. Well, that's not as common an example, but anyway, it's interesting. We use a lot of cards in these in our questions, in these ones. Okay, so here's some everyday words that you use in probability. Sorry, what am I saying? Here are some everyday words that relate to probability that you use. Probably a lot. For example, impossible. You'll use the word impossible. We like to be positive these days, so perhaps use the word definitely or certain more often. So what I want to do is talk about this number line from 0 to 1 or 0% to 100%. And this is all talking about how likely is it for something to happen. So 100% you can tell, I'm sure, is it's certainly going to happen. I might write certainly instead of certain, and we'll write definitely as well. Definitely. And that actually lines up with a probability of 1. If something has a probability of 1, I don't know, well, I guess it is maths, isn't it? Of course, I forgot for a second. Everything has numbers in maths, so certainly, if something's certainly or definitely going to happen, it has a probability of 100% or 1. But there is a probability of 0, which means it's impossible. 0% on the other end of the scale. We've got even chance and just as likely in the middle. And you might be able to work out that this is 0.5 or 50%. Probably means it's more likely than not to happen. So we'll just put probably somewhere here. Possibly. Well, we don't really want to put it anywhere because everything's possible. Possibly doesn't say very much. So if something's possible, it's everywhere except for here. It could be anywhere except for here. Funnily enough, fat chance and slim chance mean the same thing. Don't know how that happened really, but they both mean very unlikely. Oh, and I haven't put unlikely in here either, so I'll put unlikely. So when we ask how likely is something to happen, you've got likely on one side and unlikely on the other side. So these are words you use in everyday life, but they kind of line up on a line from 0 to 1 when we're talking about probability and maths. So, as we said, the main question is how likely is something to happen? So, people have always wanted to know the future. This has always been a hot topic. Even Coldplay sung a song about it. But they used to have, well, I guess we still have, definitely in some places, palm readers who will tell people that they can tell them their future by reading their palms. So people have always been interested in this. And what it is really is what we're thinking about in probability is often a way of estimating what's going to happen in the future using some experience in the past. And we'll get on to a lot more about what that means later. Now, I'm going to introduce you to some vocabulary. You don't need to know this very well yet, because we'll go into this in more depth later on. But I do want to, because it's describing probability, I want to just quickly have a look at some of these words. So, if I want to know how likely something is to happen, sometimes I can do this thing called a trial and just try it a few times. So a trial is any process which could have at least two different results. For example, let's say I flip a coin 3 times in a row. That's a trial. And the results of that trial are all called outcomes. So one example could be heads, then tails. That's an outcome. Sample space is a set of all possible outcomes of the trial. So it might not be heads, then tails. It might be all 3 heads. Or it might be heads, then tails, then heads. It could be any of these. So that's called the sample space, the list of everything that could happen, all of the outcomes. An event is just a group of outcomes. So let's say I make up an event called 2 heads. My event is called 2 heads, or 2 of the coin flips are heads. And you look at the sample space to work out how, you can look at the sample space to work out how many outcomes are in this event. And actually the outcomes I've chosen here, I have to be careful about the wording here. This should really be exactly 2 of the coin flips are heads, because you'll notice I have not included H, where 2 of them are heads, but another one's heads as well. So exactly 2 of them, and that has 3 outcomes, because there's 2 heads in this one, 2 heads in this one, 2 heads in this one. And there's a probability later on you'll be doing, writing down PR, and then you put an event in here, which means, and you'll have to calculate that. So you'll have to work out what is the probability of this particular event. And you'll work it out and you'll write the answer here, or you'll do some working. So we could do probability that 2 of the coin flips are heads. And in case you're interested, it's actually 3 out of 8. Because there's 8 outcomes here and there's 3 where 2 of them are heads. But you don't need to know that yet. All you need to know is have some idea of these words and what they mean. And we'll do a quick example to show you what it means in practice with another example. By the way, a lot of things we're doing in probability are coins, dice, and cards, so you'll have to get used to those. Alright, so a trial could be our roll a die. Notice it's die, not dice. Just be careful with that one. Because it's 1 die, multiple dice. All right, let's move on. What is a sample space? Well, I have to write down all of the possible things that could happen. So what numbers could you get? You could get 1, and usually we put them in there like a funny bracket like that, curly bracket. 1, you could get 2, 3, 4. If it's just a normal die, then you could get any number from 1 to 6. How likely is it that we get the outcome 2? Now remember, all of these are outcomes. An outcome is something that could happen as a result of the trial. So inside our sample space, we've only got one outcome out of 6 that's a 2. So that's actually the likelihood, or the probability is actually 1 out of 6. And if we look back at our line over here, we can see that that's pretty unlikely that you would get a 6. But not very unlikely. It's still, anything's possible, but it's kind of unlikely. How likely is the event rolling an even number? So remember, an event is a group of outcomes. So how many events in our sample space are even numbers? There's 3 out of 6. So that actually means the probability is 3 out of 6. We'll go into exactly how I got these fractions, by the way, but you can see that it kind of makes sense. And 3 out of 6 simplifies to a half. You can see from this as well that half of them are even numbers. So you can see that it's actually an even chance, or just as likely, to get an even number as it is to get an odd number. So your chances are the same to get an even number and odd number because they're both a half. They're half even and half odd. Okay, so that's some words that we use to describe probability. Just a quick recap. We've got all these everyday words. Impossible matches up with a 0. Certainly or definitely matches up with a 1 or 100%. And we've got some words like unlikely, likely, just as likely, or an even chance, exactly in the middle. And these ones are not so much used, but there's lots of you. I'm sure you'll find some other words that you can put on there as well, just from your everyday life. Okay, thank you for listening. I'll see you next time.